Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Playworks. We are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located on Piscataway and Susquehannock land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Wes Brown. He came to Baltimore Clayworks as a resident artist in the summer of 2018. To view more of our virtual content, please visit baltimoreclayworks.org. And I will now turn it over to Wes.
Hello, everybody. Super excited. Like Rebecca said, I was a resident at Baltimore Clayworks a number of years ago, and it's nice to still be making work and to be invited back. So we're going to go through my talk, which is just kind of my artistic journey. So let me share screen, which we worked out all the stuff on. Bingo. Here we go. We'll start from the beginning. All right, my name is Wesley Terrence Brown, but you guys can call me Wes. I first got into, there we go. I first got into ceramics when I was in high school. Didn't know much about it other than that it was challenging. And when I first started, I was bad at it, like really bad. This was me several years into it. I think I was introduced my junior year, but I didn't really know a whole lot about it. So once I finished high school, I knew that I wanted to go to college, and I knew that I didn't know enough, and I knew that I didn't know how to be an artist. And so I went to community college. I went to Sinclair Community College in Dayton, Ohio. It's one of those fortunate things where the place where you grow up happens to have one of the best community colleges in the country. If the studio looks cramped and small, it's because it is cramped and small. But there I got a chance to make, and I'm particularly on these back wheels, these kick wheels, Randall wheels, if you're familiar, that's where I learned how to throw, I mean, for the most part, because the electric wheels, all the other students were on. And I had really great teachers, teachers like Cindy Butler Jones. And while I was there, I made pots. Pots was the thing that I loved. Pots was the thing that I understood. Pots was the thing that I did. And I loved it. It was a great time. It was an opportunity for me to really cut my teeth on just basic throwing and repetitive making of the form. I finished up my time at community college, and I went on to undergrad, where my teachers were Clay Leonard and Zimra Biner. You could not have two teachers who would be more different in personality or style when it came to making. Clay makes whiteware, usually slip cast, functional trays, mugs. Zimra makes these massive sculptures that are very surreal, taking things that are recognizable. At the time, at least, we was making items that were recognizable for what you would see around the home, and then mashing onto those unknown objects, these large blobs and cloud forms. And while I was in undergrad trying to learn more, there we go, I made pots still. And all of these are mine. And if you are looking at these, you're probably thinking, Wes, what a very distinct style you have. Yes, my style at the time was everything. So in there you have some throwing and some throwing and some throwing. And then for glazing, we've got some celadons, we've got some oxblood reds, we've got some greens, some tomoku. I mean, it's all over there. We've got some sgraffito going on. We've got some sprayed glazes. We've got some dipped glazes. We've got lids of all different styles. I was all over the place. I was just, again, taking the skills that I was gaining at the time and was just throwing them all against the wall and seeing what would stick. Going on from there, at Bowling Green was the first chance I had to be a part of a community. I got to be with other like-minded, searching, excited students. Some of these students are still going on. In the front center, that's Koi Crumrine. She's working now at Queen City Clay. And you have Maria Spies. I'm not entirely sure where she is. She was in upstate New York. Now she's somewhere else doing residencies, I believe. But it was an opportunity for me to be around a community, which I didn't have at the community college. So I got to see how ceramics was something that was so much bigger than what I was doing, but got to see what other people were doing. And it was a really exciting time. During that time, I was on the wheel a lot. I made some things that got kind of funky. I made some stuff like this. These are really weird. My teachers challenged me to stop making functional pots and pushed me into sculpture. And so I started making sculpture. I remember I made this piece. I showed it to Zimra, and Zimra said, "That's still a pot." He said, "That's still a pot. It still has a shoulder. It still meets the table in the same way. It just doesn't have an opening." And I was like, okay, well, if you want something that doesn't have an opening and doesn't meet the table in the same way, I'll give you this. Do I know what this is? Absolutely not. But I was trying. I was getting outside of my comfort zone. And I trusted my teachers when they told me to stop working on pots and to try something new. And I went on from that. I think while at undergrad, we were visited by Del Haro on the right and Daniel Johnston on the left. Daniel saw what I was doing. I was trying to make some larger pieces, was really trying to push into larger scale vessels. I was trying to throw with coils and I was making a mess of it. And he and with all the Southern charm, just said, "You're bad at this. you don't know what you're doing, and it's pretty obvious. Hey, I'll help you with that. If you'll come up to where I am," because he was teaching in Michigan. He's like, "If you'll come up to Michigan, I'll show you how to make the big pots." And so I took him up at his word. I traveled to Michigan, and I got to make a big pot with him, and he showed me how. He was incredibly generous. He showed me the steps, he told me the why and the how, and it was beautiful. I took the knowledge, I went back, I think spring break happened, and not wanting to be away from the studio, knowing that my time in undergrad was going to be coming to an end, I wanted to squeeze every opportunity I had to make work. So spring break, I remember I was living in one of the dorms, and I found a friend, or I knew a friend who lived in town. I asked him if I could stay at his place. He said, "Sure, you could stay at my place." And so I went to the studio every day with no classes over spring break. I remember there was a snowstorm. My car almost got towed for being on the street during a snow emergency. It was a mess, but I was able to get to the studio every day and make a pot. It took me maybe about 7 hours to make a single one of these jars. By the end, I think I got it down to maybe 4 hours, and I fired them in a wood kiln. And because of the connection that I made with Daniel, he was like, "Hey, you seem to be pretty smart, intelligent. You like what we're doing here. How would you like to come to North Carolina? Maybe you want to think about an apprenticeship." And so we set up some days, and at the same time, during undergrad, a friend approached me and said, "Hey, I really want to study abroad." And I was like, "Well, I have no plans to study abroad." And she said, "Well, I'm going to go to a meeting. I'm going to see if I can get some funding. Do you want to come with?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I ended up going to the meeting, found out that because it wasn't through our university, there wasn't going to be any funding, but I decided, hey, you know what? Let me look up funding opportunities. So I ended up applying for some funding through the Toledo Museum of Art, which was just for travel. And I found another place and ended up getting enough funding to go on the West Virginia University trip. So I had that planned for the summer. So the plan was for the summer to go to China with West Virginia University, study ceramics for a month, come back, and then head to North Carolina for 2 months before starting my final semester of school. And this was 2014. I could not have planned this. It was not something that I saw. But while I was getting ready to go to China, this happened. As we all remember, it was Ferguson. So as I went abroad for the first time traveling outside of the States, and I was seeing things like this in Shanghai, I was watching the news and seeing what was happening in America. And it was this really odd thing because I had minority status while in the States, and while traveling abroad was still minority status, but I was known as an American. And so I traveled around, and it was just getting a chance to see a culture that was completely different, yet still full of people who are people. And we eventually went to Jingdezhen, China. I wish that I made this piece. I did not make this piece. It's a gorgeous piece. But while I was there, I learned how to do things in the Chinese way. So I made blue and white ware. I learned how to do carving. Finished up our month there. Came, I think, home for 5 days, or it was less than a week, and then drove to North Carolina. I was at East Fork Pottery back when it was still dirt floors. I was with Alex Matisse and John Viglin. They showed me how to make work the way they did. I stacked wood, and then went from there to Daniel Johnston's. I was there for 2 weeks, then was Daniel Johnston's for the rest of the summer. It was over a month. Doing manual labor in the morning and then throwing pots in the afternoon and then having a break. And as this stuff was happening in the US, traveling around the South, I had the chance to like really get back to my roots, and I wanted to learn history because I had never learned African American history before. So every afternoon, evening, I had a view like this. And I began to read and I began to educate myself. Though being a Black man, I had never gotten a Black history. My parents had done a little bit of talking about it, but for the most part, we didn't talk about race. We were we were very much probably upper middle class, went to private schools all my life up until college. And so I didn't learn that history. I was in predominantly white spaces. And so I began to read. I read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. I read Cornel West's Race Matters. I read in fiction, I read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Sula, as well as Uncle Tom's Cabin for the first time. And when I came back, and with all of these racial tensions boiling up and social media just showing me where people stood on it, I came back to my final semester of undergrad thinking about race, being steeped in all the conversations around it. And so that's what I made work on. And so I had this one, Whites Kill Whites, Blacks Kill Blacks. The bottom line is a conversation, an excerpt from a conversation from the Bill O'Reilly show when he was talking with Tavish Smiley. I thought about my own standing. I stand your ground. This was an iron sculpture. I finished my time in undergrad with what I felt was a very cohesive portfolio. I remember meeting with John Balistreri, who was the professor, who I don't have listed because he was only there for a short period, or rather I was only there for a short period when he was on sabbatical and then research leave. But he looked through my portfolio, asked me what I wanted to do next, and I said, I don't know. I don't have enough. I'm not good enough yet. I know that I'm not the artist that I want to be. I know that I don't know enough. I need to know more. And so we talked about grad schools. I applied and I got in. So I went to Indiana University in Bloomington. This was my studio there. And while I was there, I think I thought, hey, I'm going to continue with the race work, which I thought was highly conceptual and had a lot of knowledge. And I found that I was unable to make that work anymore. There was a number of things that going through learning that history, having that change of perspective, that widening of the mind to what had happened, what was happening. The fire of that had started to burn low, and I had accepted it, where in the beginning I was fighting it and therefore making work to help process it. And I had taken the time and I had processed through all of it, and I no longer felt like I could make that work anymore, at least not to the same degree that I was. And I hit roadblock. And I remember talking to my professor, who was also Black, Malcolm Smith, and I was like, I don't know what to do. And he said, make something, make anything. We brought you in here because we believe in you. We didn't bring you in here because we wanted you to continue making the work that you were. So make what you can. And so I did. And so I started making work that I went back to pots that I knew. And I thought about silhouette and I thought about hiding it. I thought about, what if I were to reduce a form to shape? And so I threw pieces on the wheel and then combined them. And then I thought, well, what if I got off the wheel and just worried about that silhouette and worked with a clay that would hide it? And I was really excited with that. And things got funky. And I had the opportunity, after a particularly bad critique, where I kind of threw myself under the bus. Having spent an entire semester studying teapots, I then presented teapots and said that they weren't, which was not a good decision. And rightfully so, I was raked over the coals for it. I realized, hey, I'm getting away from my roots. I'm getting away from my pottery roots. I need to be with a potter. And so I cold called, or cold emailed, sent out emails to a bunch of potters all across the country that I knew or didn't know or knew of. And I asked, hey, do you need an assistant for the summer? Do you need someone to help? I want to be in a pottery. I want to be around art. I want to be around ceramics. I want to be around clay. I want to be around pots. I want to know the people who make them because I want to be a part of that. And Mark Gertson on the left responded. He was in upstate Indiana, up on the Michigan border. And he said, yeah, I can give you a couple days. He's like, I can't pay you to be an assistant for long, but I can keep you for a little bit. And I came back, I went there, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 days, and came back and found out that there was Daniel Evans, who was in my backyard in Bloomington, Indiana. And so I got to work with both of them. And Daniel was an individual who made work that looked like this. And it was big, and it was cracked, and it was heaving under the weight of itself. And I thought it was fascinating. And he introduced me to chicken grit. And I took that and I put that into my clay because I'd been told, like, you throw so tight, Wes, why don't you throw looser? And I was like, okay, well, let me throw this in. So I loved it because it scarred the work. You'd catch a piece of it and it would tear. And there was something about that roughness that I liked, that I didn't know how to replicate any other way. And it was during this time that I was going from my first year of grad school into my second of a 3-year program. And I had everything set up. I had friends. I had a good church community. I had friends in the studio. I was making work. Everything was going well. And suddenly I found it hard to eat and then hard to sleep. And then everything became hard. And then suddenly I found that I didn't have a love for making work anymore. And I was in a depression. Ended up having to go to emergency counseling. I don't advise that you wait to have to go to emergency counseling, but that's what happened. And I realized that my life was a cycle and that had changed. And so I took that and put that in my work, and I cut the pieces so that it would stop. And I took that and I thought that was really exciting. At the same time, I began taking a textiles course where we screen printed. And then at the end of the screen printing, we ripped it into pieces and we quilted it back together. And I said, oh my goodness, if this isn't my life, I don't know what is. And so I took that back to the ceramic studio. And I took all these slabs and I would slam them together and then I'd stand them up and make pots out of them. And it was super exciting. And I decided eventually I started to get out of making pots and started getting into making sculptures out of these rough, hard pieces, heavily textured. And I said, and the transition from this to the next one was I realized that I could not continue to do wood firing. That was too much work. And I said, well, what if I tried to hide it? What if I tried to hide all the texture? And I made it black. And it just worked. And this was the process for making them. So I would take clay, slap it across the floor to make a textured slab, or what I referred to as a quilt. I would stiffen that up over barrels or buckets. Somehow all the buckets, all the steel trash cans in the studio somehow made their way to my studio. Don't know how it is. There was a certain amount of magnetism going on there. But I would stand those pieces up, and then I would start to build. And this was the first that I made in what I referred to as my monument series. I made a total of 7, and those became my thesis show, which I was very proud of. They all weighed a tremendous amount of weight. And somewhere in there, because grad school isn't hard enough, I decided that I'd get married. This is my lovely wife, Unity. We celebrated 6 years this past June, going strong. And I took the experience from that and I went, what's next? And I said, well, I like teaching, but I know I don't have the experience. 2 years of teaching in grad school is not enough experience to get a full-time job in teaching. So what did I do? I applied to Baltimore Clayworks and I got into the 1-year residency. And the one thing that I learned in Baltimore was, let's get this bread. I learned at Baltimore that I was going to have to work. And I also found that I had a real passion for teaching. And that's what I did. I was a working artist and educator, teaching at a number of places. And I realized that the large sculptures that I was making, that I wasn't going to be able to sell those very regularly. People aren't usually buying those 200 to 400 pound sculptures every day. And so I said, how can I make a meeting of pots with sculpture? And so this is what I did. This was my first attempt at it. I made a sculptural like manger, and then I just dropped a bowl into it. And this was the beginning of what I've been working on now for the last few years. This was 2018 going into 2019. I fired that. I figured out other ways to combine, and that's where it slowly built. This meeting of smooth wheel thrown parts with heavily textured slabs. I left the residency in 2019 at the end of the year. And then we all know what happened after 2019. COVID hit. Lives got turned upside down. And what did I do? Well, I was driving Uber. Tried to get into some other residencies, didn't make it. Tried to apply for some jobs, didn't get those. And so I was driving Uber. COVID hit. I was doing Instacart, made some friends in the arts community, which, I mean, I can't think of any other communities outside of religious ones that are as accepting and as supportive as the ceramics community. But I made friends with Daniel Botbill at East Metro Clay, or attached to the companion gallery. He said, hey, if you come on out, you need to be working. Like, you need to be making stuff in clay. It's not good for you to not make stuff. And I'll pay for the clay. If you can drive here, I'll put you up. And that was amazing. So I got to do a short-term residency there for 2 weeks, and I just got to make all the work and explore and make different forms. And he said, well, you know, the one thing that you got, he's like, you got the bowls and they look good. Can you make other forms? And I was like, well, I can make these. They're kind of flower vases. And he's like, well, can you make the thing that everybody likes, you know? And I'm like, what does everybody like? He's like, well, the thing that people buy is mugs. Can you make mugs? And I was like, well, let me try. And so I made a first mug and I handed it to him, and he was just like, this is a great idea of a mug. This is an idea. This is not a functioning mug. I need you to go work on this some more. And I was like, okay, I'll work on it some more. So I worked on, okay, how can I make a cylinder? Because that's what a mug is. That's the meeting of these heavy textures and this smooth. And eventually I figured out a way to get the two to meet together. And it was I was making the bowls, which was seating a bowl into that heavy sculpture. And now I was figuring out how I could seat a cylinder into it and add a handle to make a mug. And so I said, well, the next thing is like, well, if you're going to have mugs, you got to have something to pour into the mug. So I was like, well, you know, I like tea, so I'll make some teapots. And so I started throwing the top sections of these teapots and then seeding those into the sculpture, the sculptural elements. And that's kind of how things grew. I had a solo show at the Companion, which went extremely well. Was able to sell out in less than 24 hours. And people really received the work very well. And I was like, okay, I'm going to continue on this. And so I've continued to work on it. I took a teaching job at East Stroudsburg University, and I got to do a solo show there. I was there for 2 years. Just turned in my keys last week as I've moved on to the new place. And this was from my solo show, which was an opportunity for the first time to show my sculptural monuments with my functional ware, the left one being a large jar. And I had the opportunity to kind of move onto the wall, which I think is definitely a direction that I'm going to continue to go into. And so as I've continued on in making these pieces, it's really trying to figure out, like, how do I make the sculptures work? How do I get this texture and this wheel to come together? Now, with these wall pieces, I've been really excited because I would make all of this, I would texture all of my slabs, and then I would cut the slabs into pieces to make the parts for the vessels. And I said, what if I took that and just put it on the wall? And so I'm really excited about this. I'm going to continue to make more of these, and I definitely think that they need to get more complicated, in that I need more textures and I need more levels. Right now, I'm very content and to continue making these and working on making the vessels. So this is a teapot. It's one of the larger ones that I unloaded out of the kiln last week, that actually went away to a collector. But I've been enjoying making vessels. There's something exciting about having a piece that's going to function. All of the vessels that I make, the teapots, the mugs that I create, are functional. You can put your tea in them. You can put your boiling water. You can steep in there. The only thing you can't do is, even though the bottoms are very flat, they are not for stoves. They are not for open flames or anything like that. So any way that you would use a regular teapot, these function in the same exact way. So I feel very fortunate to have been a resident at Baltimore Clay Works. The things that I learned there, the lessons I've definitely continued to carry, and the ways that I was able to experiment in making new works. And I think the constraints of, especially being right out of grad school at Baltimore as a resident, was that I didn't have any funding for the buying of materials or firings. I think firings were at cost. And so suddenly I had to go, okay, well, if I'm going to make work and I just need to break even, I need to make enough on the work that I'm making so that I can buy the materials to continue making more work. Meant that I had to go into things that were smaller, and that constraint led to innovation. And it's been really exciting to continue on with that. I've really loved making the teapots, and I'm going to continue definitely to do so. But this is kind of my journey as an artist, from starting in high school to figuring out, like, where do I want to be, and working it all along the way. If you want to find me online, these are the places where you can find my work, particularly a lot of videos. WesleyTBrown.com is my website, which I should be updating probably in the next month or so. Instagram is a really good place if you want to see a lot of in-process work, fun little videos and reels. And then TikTok. TikTok is something that I've started. Have not gotten TikTok famous just yet, but I do post a couple things on there. I think it's a really great platform for sharing somewhat medium length content. But yeah, I want to say thank you so much to Baltimore Clay Works for inviting me out to do this talk. I always love being able to share where I've come from, so that people can see that, like, it didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of years to figure this out. But if you're making, it's worth it. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm completely open to answer any questions that people have. Thanks.